What is the current human rights situation in Peru and how has it changed since Fujimori? What is the current human rights situation in Peru and how has it changed since Alberto Fujimori's presidency? Let's take a closer look at this important topic. The human rights landscape in Peru today faces serious challenges. There are ongoing issues with justice for past abuses, restrictions on civil liberties, and rising violence and insecurity. During Fujimori's presidency in the 1990s, Peru experienced widespread human rights violations. The country was in the midst of an internal armed conflict with groups like the Shining Path. Fujimori's government was responsible for extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, and torture. These actions led to national and international condemnation, which eventually sparked a broader human rights movement in Peru. Since Fujimori's time, there have been some advances in recognizing victims' rights and establishing mechanisms for truth and justice. However, recent developments indicate a troubling reversal. In 2025, the Peruvian government enacted an amnesty law. This law grants impunity to members of the armed forces, police, and self-defense groups for crimes committed during the internal conflict from 1980 to 2000. This move threatens to undo decades of efforts to hold perpetrators accountable for serious violations, such as extrajudicial executions and torture. The amnesty law contradicts international human rights standards and rulings by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. This development is seen as a betrayal of victims and a setback for justice and reconciliation in Peru. Moreover, the government has implemented laws that restrict freedom of expression and association. For instance, a 2025 law regulating the Peruvian Agency for International Cooperation imposes controls over civil society organizations. This enables censorship and limits the ability of non-governmental organizations to operate freely, especially those critical of the government. Security remains a major concern in Peru, with rising crime rates, including homicides and extortion. The government's response has included states of emergency and the suspension of basic rights in certain areas. However, these measures have been criticized for being ineffective and disproportionately affecting vulnerable populations. The political climate is also contentious, with discussions around lowering the age of criminal responsibility for serious crimes. Human rights institutions oppose this idea, highlighting the need for a more humane approach. From the perspective of Latin culture, which values community and justice, these recent shifts are alarming. The amnesty law and restrictions on civil society dismiss the suffering of thousands of Peruvians who endured violence during the conflict. They undermine the collective demand for truth and accountability. The legacy of Fujimori's authoritarianism still weighs heavily on Peru's social and political life. Current policies risk repeating patterns of impunity and repression instead of fostering genuine reconciliation and respect for human rights. While Peru has made strides since Fujimori's time in addressing human rights violations, the present situation reflects significant challenges. The recent amnesty law, restrictions on freedoms, and security policies indicate a regression that threatens justice for victims and the protection of fundamental rights. These developments raise concerns about the future of democracy and human rights in Peru.